Joining us for today's conversation is Texas State Representative James Talarico, who represents House District 50, which covers a good chunk of Travis County. Representative Talarico, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we're talking about Christian nationalism today, which seems like it's right up your alley because you are also, in addition to being a state representative, a seminary student.
That's right.
So talk to us about how that's prepared you for your work in the legislature.
And not a Christian nationalist.
Not a Christian nationalist. Yes, thank you. This is not the pro-Christian nationalist program.
Right.
All right. Good disclaimer.
Yeah. Well, I actually just came from seminary.
Right.
So for those that can't tell by watching, we're right across the street from Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. So I
studying Greek today, right?
That's right. So this summer I'm doing an intensive Greek course. I took Hebrew last semester and now taking Greek this summer. And it's I always tell people it's kind of a palate cleanser from the legislature. Everyone in the seminary is kind and nurturing and supportive. That's obviously not what I would use to describe a lot of people at the legislature. So it's nice for me personally just to balance out those kind of two spaces. But it's also, I think, helped me in my political work. Jesus gave us two commandments: love God and love neighbor.
Seems pretty simple.
Yeah,
right.
It's nice to have a Cliff Notes version of all the law and the prophets. And what I do at the legislature is try to love my neighbors, right? Whether it's working on education policy, healthcare policy, environmental policy, infrastructure, all of that is about ensuring my neighbors, in the broadest sense of the term, in every part of the state, have what they need to thrive and flourish. But after doing that work for 5 years, I realized it's not sustainable if you don't pair it with that first commandment, if there's not an inner life that complements the outer life. And I think too often in our faith, there's this false division of labor between those who act, those who work, those who organize, and then those who pray, right? When I think all along, those two were meant to be in union. And in my experience so far doing this work, you need both.
Right.
It doesn't have to be explicitly religious and certainly doesn't need to be Christian.
Right.
But you need some kind of inner spiritual life, I think, to sustain the difficult work of politics.
Right. I think that's helpful. And our listeners come to public policy from a faith perspective. So how does that, how do you use your faith to guide your policy principles?
Yeah. I mean, my faith is why I'm in politics. So I grew up at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, which is right outside Austin city limits, up 35, led by Reverend Jim Rigby, who is a graduate of the seminary across the street.
Right. And,
that it was always, Dr. Jim always taught us that love has to grow into justice.
Right.
Justice is just love out in public, right?
Amen.
And so that our church was really active in LGBTQ rights in the 90s. We caught some attention by letting an atheist join our church in the 2000s. And then in the 2010s, again, stirred some controversy by housing an undocumented family, a mother and son who were close to being deported by ICE. And so, again, the idea that Christianity is just another word for causing trouble.
Right.
And so that was the tradition that I was brought up in, and it's what led me to teach public school students on the west side of San Antonio, led me to run an education nonprofit, and then led me to run for office, I guess, 5 years ago now.
Many of our listeners will share that idea of Christianity or that idea of faith. But there's certainly another expression that has been taking hold here in the great state of Texas, represented in this idea of Christian nationalism, which has really been coming to the forefront the last couple of legislative sessions, the last couple of years. Many of us would see that as a threat to American democracy. Is that overstating it, or how do you
No, I don't think so at all. I think I struggle with the term Christian nationalism because in some ways it assumes that the people pushing this worldview, this ideology, are coming from a Christian perspective.
Right.
And I reject that because the religion of folks pushing Christian nationalism doesn't resemble the Christianity that I belong to. And so not only is Christian nationalism or Christofascism, whatever term you want to use. Not only is it subverting our democracy, it's also perverting our faith. And that's why, to me, it's incumbent upon people of faith, whether you're a Christian or whether you belong to another tradition, to speak out on these bills, these proposals that seek to force a certain type of Christianity, what I would call Christofascism, on everyone. And we saw that through this entire legislative session. And to me, it's not only unconstitutional, it's not only un-American, it's also deeply un-Christian.
The Texas Impact staff was talking pre-session about that Christian nationalism or Christian fascism seeping into the Texas legislature. Yeah. What do you think is causing that? What's driving that viewpoint?
Yeah, well, I think we've got to recognize that this has been a long time coming. The religious right has been organizing and growing since, I think you could say, the 1970s. So that's more than 40 years ago. So I think that's important, that this is not just a recent phenomenon. This is something that is kind of coming to fruition after decades of building and organizing and recruiting. And to me, it's essentially the worship of power, social power, political power, economic power, in the name of Christ. Because to me, Christofascism, Christian nationalism, bears no resemblance to the gospel of Jesus Christ,
right,
or to the New Testament that I study across the street. I can't find any parallels. I can't find any similarities. In fact, I find that they are diametrically opposed to each other. And so that's why I think it's important to clarify that Christian nationalism is anything but Christian.
Right.
We know that Jesus was tempted by the devil out in the wilderness, and one of the things the devil offered was political power, right? All the kingdoms in the world. And Jesus rejected that. You can't limit a faith or a religion of universal love and inclusion to one political subdivision, and you certainly can't force it onto people or coerce them to join that kind of organic movement. So I think it's important not only to criticize Christian nationalism on constitutional grounds, but also on theological grounds.
Let's talk about the policy grounds. This is, and you did a great job throughout the legislative session of calling it out when you saw it, but this is our legislative wrap-up series. So I'd love if you could spend a few minutes talking about where you saw this ideology in legislation this past session.
I mean, gosh, once you identify it, you can start to see it everywhere. Right. We certainly saw it explicitly in the Ten Commandments bill that would have mandated a poster of the Ten Commandments be displayed in every public school classroom in the state.
Right.
We saw it in the bill that would have allowed school districts to replace guidance counselors with religious chaplains, including untrained, internet certified religious chaplains without a background check. But you also saw it in the school voucher bill that would have diverted precious taxpayer dollars away from our underfunded public schools into unaccountable, oftentimes religious Christian private schools. You saw it in the anti-LGBTQ legislation, including the bill that would have denied gender-affirming health care to trans children. And then, of course, infamously, we saw it last session with the most extreme abortion ban in the country. All these ideologies stem from this Christofascism movement, which essentially, like I said, is just using faith to exercise raw political, social, and economic power.
Right.
And I think it's dangerous to all of us, but particularly those who are marginalized and oppressed in our state.
I want to get to our homework in just a second, but some of these bills are now moving down to the local level, specifically the school chaplain bill. There's action that people need to take at the local level in the months to come too, right?
Yes, and I hope anyone watching will get them. Hopefully, they're already involved in our school system, regardless of whether or not you have kids in school.
Right.
And if you are, I hope you will let your school board members know about some of these really dangerous organizations that are pushing this school chaplain proposal, particularly something called the National School Chaplain Association. It sounds innocuous, But once you dig into this group, their stated purpose is to, quote, infiltrate our public schools. Their CEO is I can't believe I'm saying this, but he's a self-identified former drug smuggling pirate saved by divine intervention. I know it sounds ridiculous. A lot of the work I do at the legislature has become ridiculous, unfortunately,
yes.
Based on what my colleagues have been putting forward. But this organization has said that students who are suicidal don't need professional counseling. They just need to be heard. The CEO of this organization says he has an app where he can pray with students who are suicidal. Again, I think if a student is thinking about suicide, they need professional help and they need it right away.
Right.
Our school counselors they have to have a master's degree. They have to teach in a classroom for 2 years before they can be a counselor. They are trained to provide students with professional guidance and support. Not all chaplains are, and this bill would open the door for some of these sketchy folks like the National School Chaplain Association to work with our kids unsupervised.
Yeah. Listeners, will inevitably be talking about that more in the weeks to come. But one of the things that I think is always important is that there are a lot of these issues that are being driven by people of faith with different perspectives than our listeners, than people who care about the public good and diversity. What advice do you have to listeners, or what challenge do you have to listeners about what they should be doing to combat some of these other voices?
Well, I think it's, as I said earlier, we as people of faith have a moral obligation to speak out against this movement that is perverting our faith and is subverting our democracy. And so I hope anybody watching will get involved, whether it's through your faith community, whether it's through a political organization, a grassroots organization locally, to do what we can to push back against this. And oftentimes that means using our voice as Christians or as people of faith to criticize this, not just on political grounds, not just on constitutional grounds, but on theological grounds,
right.
Because we have a religion of universal inclusion, right? That's symbolized best through Jesus's open table fellowship, where everyone was invited, particularly those who have been left out. And this Christofascism movement is all about excluding.
Right.
It's all about defining who's in the group and who's out of the group, and trying to exercise raw political power to keep those who are outside the group outside.
Right.
And that is diametrically opposed to the teachings of Jesus Christ, and we have to point that out at every opportunity.
I always like when we have elected representatives on to ask this question, because we go out and talk with people throughout the state about meeting with your representatives and having conversations with candidates. How important is that? And how important is that for people to come with a faith perspective when they have those conversations? How can they do that well?
Yeah, I mean, your representative works for you, right? Your state senator works for you. And so you have to ensure that your voice is being heard. And it can be through sending an email or making a phone call. But as with any relationship, it's best to have that in-person, face-to-face conversation. And so if you're a constituent, I hope you'll take advantage of this interim when we're not in session to meet with your state rep and meet with their staff members who are doing the work every day in the Capitol on your behalf. And absolutely, we should form those connections in the most genuine way possible. And so if you're a person of faith, you should bring that to the conversation, and you should share how these bills that exclude and persecute and bully those on the outside, how those bills make you feel. Yeah. And I think that's the best way to make progress, is establish those genuine connections with people, come to the conversation in good faith, and be true and honest in what you share.
I really appreciate the time. Really appreciate the words. I'm going to give you a chance here at the end. Any shameless plugs or anything else you want to hit on today?
I would encourage everyone to, obviously they're listening to this podcast, which is great because Texas Impact does some of the best organizing work in the Capitol, but subscribe to your local news outlet. The nationalization of media means that most news organizations focus on what's happening in DC, what's happening in Congress or the White House, obviously important. But what's more important is what's happening at the local level,
right.
Not just the state legislature, but at your local school board, at your local county commissioner's court, at your city council. So I always recommend to folks that they sign up or subscribe or follow a local news outlet or a nonprofit news outlet like the Texas Tribune to really be informed, because that's the first step in getting involved in making change.
I appreciate that. Representative, I can't help you with your Greek class, but if you were taking preaching this summer, I'd give an amen and recommend to your pastor or your professor. So thank you so much for the time. Thanks for the work you're doing. Keep up the great work.
Thank you for having me.